Yeah, hey, Bina. Good morning, my relatives. Today is November 29th, which is a Monday, and I am sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. And I want to remember today the massacre at Sand Creek, which was part of Abraham Lincoln's ethnic cleansing policies to complete the Transcontinental Railway, and it was committed 157 years ago in eastern Colorado. But before I begin, as I always do, let me start by acknowledging the people whose land I'm on today. And so I moved about 6 years ago with my family from the Navajo Nation to what's now called Washington, D.C. And these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to thank the Piscataway and acknowledge them as the host people of these lands. I want to just state publicly how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So I was sitting down to do my second cup of coffee this morning, and I get news updates from Native News Online, which is one of the Native websites I follow pretty closely. I actually write for them occasionally. I've done some work for them in the past. And as I was browsing the headlines, was reminded that today was the 157th anniversary of the massacre at Sand Creek. And I'm going to share that story from Native News Online right there in the comment section. And I encourage you to read that later today. I knew this date was coming up. I thought it was in the first week of December. I forgot it was at the last week of November. And so it emotionally took me a little bit by shock this morning. If you watched my sunrise this morning, you'll notice I didn't even mention it because it wasn't on my mind. I thought it was coming up in it either later this week or early next week. And so I wanted to do something this morning, and I don't have a lot of time because I have another interview scheduled, but I wanted to make sure I came on to commemorate this atrocity, but also to honor the people of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. And I went to their website today, and I'm going to share their link right here. I just went to browse their website this morning, and here is the website to their tribal website. And you can look under the history and culture section, and you'll learn a few things there. And I noticed today that one of the events they're hosting was Sand Creek Run, which is something they do every year. This year they're holding it virtually, and it's too late to register for it, but you can learn about it, and I just put that in the comment section there too. And I want to honor and acknowledge the Cheyenne and Arapaho as the host people of the city where I used to live, which is Denver, Colorado. And so this massacre actually has a lot of pain for me because I actually lived in the lands that were ethnically cleansed, so that that city could be built up. And so I was thinking of what was the best way to honor this, and I thought, there's a lot of things that I could do, but I thought I would just read. We have an extensive section, or a section of our book that talks about the Cheyenne and Arapaho and about the Sand Creek Massacre. In the book I co-authored, Unsettling Truths. And in the chapter 10, which is the second chapter about Abraham Lincoln, we have a section titled The Massacre at Sand Creek. And I'm just going to read this section for you this morning. This is on page 155 in chapter 10. The chapter is titled Abraham Lincoln and Native Genocide. In July 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the Second Pacific Railway Act. This act doubled the amount of land to set aside for the Transcontinental Railway and reversed the exception for mineral lands, meaning that railway companies could now produce more lands containing iron and coal in their government land requests. Later in the same year, in November of 1864, the U.S. Army, still under the command of the Commander-in-Chief Abraham Lincoln, committed the massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado. In 1851, the United States signed a treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, establishing much of what today is eastern Colorado, western Kentucky, southern Wyoming, and southeast Nebraska as their treaty lands. In 1858, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains, and over the next 3 years, Cheyenne and Arapaho lands were overrun with more than 100,000 1,000 prospectors and settlers. In February of 1861, less than 1 month before the inauguration of President Lincoln, the U.S. signed another treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Fort Wise, Colorado. The Treaty of Fort Wise was signed was suspect because it was signed only by a minority of Cheyenne chiefs and the Eastern Arapaho chiefs, and was never given consent by the broader tribes. In the Treaty of Fort Wise, the Indians settled for a tract between Sand Creek and the Arkansas River, less than 1/13 the size of their 1851 reserve. With the treaty not having received approval from all of the tribes, certain Cheyenne and Lakota tribes opposed white settlers moving into their lands. In 1864, a group of Civil War soldiers under the command of Colonel John Shivington, a Methodist minister, began to attack several Cheyenne tribes. Two chiefs attempted to establish a truce by setting up near Fort Lyon as a friendly gesture. They were advised to fly an American flag as an expression of their peaceful intentions. Colonel Shivington, however, ordered the slaughter of the camp while the majority of the males were out hunting. On February 29, 1864, approximately 675 U.S. soldiers under the command of Colonel John Shivington killed more than 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers, mostly elderly women, men, and children. Approximately 180 miles southeast of Denver, near Eads, Colorado. Despite assurances from the American negotiators that they would be safe, and despite Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle raising both a United States flag and a white flag as symbols of peace, Colonel Shivington ordered his troops to take no prisoners and to pillage and set the village ablaze, violently forcing the ambushed and outnumbered Cheyenne and Arapaho villagers to flee on foot. Colonel Shivington and his troops paraded mutilated body parts of men, women, and children in downtown Denver in celebration of this massacre. Initially, the massacre was celebrated, but after the gruesome details became public, an investigation was eventually initiated by the military into Colonel Shivington's actions. He was reprimanded, but then allowed to retire. Within 18 months after the massacre at Sand Creek, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were completely removed from Colorado to a reservation in Oklahoma. During his annual address to Congress in December of 1864, President Lincoln announced that a total of 1.5 million acres had been successfully homesteaded through the Homestead Act. Regarding the Transcontinental Railway, he reported that a great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. Both of these acts were hugely symbolic in the quest to fulfill the national self-proclaimed manifest destiny. Today is a day of mourning. I mourn with my Cheyenne and Arapaho relatives. I thank them for their resilience, for their stewardship of the lands, and I honor them as the host people of the land of Eastern Colorado. I am deeply distressed by the ethnic cleansing policies of Abraham Lincoln and by the fact that our nation continues to celebrate him as one of our greatest leaders. This day will go unnoticed by much of our nation. It will go unnoticed by many Americans. Most media outlets will not report on this. But today, 157 years ago, President Abraham Lincoln continued his brutal genocide and ethnic cleansing policies of destroying Native homes, massacring Native peoples to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. If you remember from just the event I did last week where I talked about Thanksgiving, Abraham Lincoln was in the process of completing the Transcontinental Railway, and he had signed both the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. And then after the removal of the Dakota and Winnebago from Minnesota, after the massacre at Sand Creek in Colorado, after the long walk of the Navajo, Mescalero Apache in New Mexico and Arizona, and after the Bear River Massacre in northern Utah and southern Idaho, Abraham Lincoln had literally ethnically cleansed most of the major routes for the Transcontinental Railway. Today, my relatives, is a day of mourning. Today is a day to not only honor the Cheyenne and Arapaho people for their resilience and the fact that they still are here, but today is a day to mourn the fact that we celebrate our president who committed these atrocities. And we actually have the gall to refer to him as one of our greatest presidents. I am ashamed and embarrassed to be an American citizen today because of the way that we honor Abraham Lincoln, even though he was a blatant white supremacist and one of the most ethnic cleansing presidents in our nation's history. If you'd like to learn more about the Sand Creek Massacre, I invite you to look at this website by the National Park Service, and they have more details about that massacre. But more than anything else, I encourage you to spend time on the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal website and to learn about them and what they have to say about themselves and as a people. I put that again once more in the comment section for today. So I hope that you will join me, and I'd like to end just by taking a moment of silence. Silence to honor the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, and a moment to reflect on the shame of our nation. We can do better. We must do better. Please join me in continuing to work to create common memory, to teach our nation's history, to do land acknowledgements and honor the host people of these lands, and to not allow our history to be pushed aside and washed away, and therefore never addressed, and worst of all, never healed. Akiahat, my relatives, thank you for joining me today. If you would like to read more about in my book, I'm going to share one more link for this in the comment section. The book that I co-authored, Unsettling Truths. It's an InterVarsity Press book. My co-author is Soong-Chan Rah, and we have signed copies available on my website. But I encourage you to take some time today to research more about the massacre at Sand Creek, and please continue with me in creating this common memory. Akiaha, my relatives, walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Ako on that.